Imagine being a 3-meter tall apex predator with a skull the size of a horse's head, a beak that can crack bones like breadsticks, and absolutely nothing on your continent that can challenge you. You're basically the dinosaur that never went extinct. And yet, the one thing you need to be genuinely terrified of? Your own children? Take a look at this terror bird. And yes, that's actually what scientists call them, because apparently nightmare murder ostrich was too on the nose. Notice that massive beak, those tree trunk legs, that I've never known fear stance. Well, it turns out that despite being South America's most dominant predator for over 50 million years, these birds had evolved one of the most disturbing parent-child relationships in the animal kingdom. And the reason why has everything to do with a biological quirk so bizarre that it would make Kronos, the Greek titan who ate his own children, say, yeah, that's pretty messed up. If you've heard of terror birds, or Phorus rhabdidae, if you want to get technical about it, you probably know them as the monsters that ruled South America after the dinosaurs went extinct. And monster really isn't an exaggeration here. We're talking about flightless birds that stood anywhere from 1 to 3 meters tall, or 3 to 10 feet if you're not into the metric system, with the largest species, Calenkin guillermois, sporting a skull that measured 71 centimeters, or 28 inches, making it the largest skull of any known bird ever. To put that in perspective, that's longer than a baseball bat. A skull, just the skull. And this wasn't some fragile hollow thing either. This was a solid chunk of bone designed to support a beak that functioned as both weapon and tools. These birds were built like if you took a cassowary, gave it a growth hormone addiction, and then sent it to anger management classes where it learned nothing. Their legs were pure muscle, likely capable of running at speeds up to 50 miles per hour, faster than a racehorse, while their beaks were hooked, compressed from side to side, and designed to function like a meat cleaver crossed with a pickaxe. Studies on their bite force suggest they could generate enough pressure to crush the skull of medium-sized mammals, and fossil evidence shows they absolutely did this regularly. We're talking about a bird that could run down a horse if horses had existed back then, and then proceed to turn that horse into a very sad pile of horse-shaped regrets. So naturally, you'd assume these birds were the undisputed champions of their ecosystem. No predators to worry about, no competition for food, just decades of terrorizing everything else that had the misfortune of evolving in South America during the Cenozoic era. And you'd be mostly right. Terror birds were apex predators that dominated for over 50 million years, which is longer than the entire reign of Tyrannosaurus rex, by a factor of about 17. Let that sink in for a second. T-Rex gets all the glory, all the movies, all the merchandise, and it only lasted 3 million years. Terror birds, they had 50 times that, and somehow ended up with a fraction of the name recognition. Talk about getting robbed by history. To put their success in perspective, terror birds outlasted the saber-toothed cats, ground sloths, and glyptodonts. They saw the Andes Mountains rise from basically nothing. They watched as South America drifted closer to North America over millions of years. Some species even made it into North America themselves, before ultimately going extinct about 2.5 million years ago. For context, modern humans have only been around for about 300,000 years. Terror birds had 50 times that. These birds were so successful for so long that they witnessed more of Earth's history than most mammal lineages have even existed. But here's where things start to get strange. Now, with a track record like that, you'd think terror bird parents would be pretty chill, right? After all, what do they have to worry about? Their chicks would grow up to be unstoppable murder machines. Except here's the thing, they didn't grow up. At least not for a really, really long time. And by really long time, I mean that some species of terror birds took up to 10 years to reach full adult size. 10 years. To put that in perspective, a chicken reaches maturity in about 6 months. An emu takes 2 to 3 years. Even an ostrich, the largest living bird, is fully grown by age 3 or 4. But terror birds, they took an entire decade to finish puberty. And during that time, they were vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable, and not just to other predators. They were vulnerable to each other. See, paleontologists have found something disturbing in the fossil record. Juvenile terror bird remains with bite marks that match adult terror bird beaks. At first, researchers thought maybe this was evidence of scavenging, adults eating already dead young. But then they found healed bite wounds on fossilized juvenile bones, meaning these attacks happened while the young birds were still alive. And here's where it gets dark. Analysis of the bite placement suggests these weren't defensive wounds or territorial disputes. These were predatory attacks. In other words, adult terror birds, possibly including the parents themselves, were hunting their own young. And the reason comes down to one of the most brutal quirks of biology: altricial chick development taken to an absolute extreme. Most bird chicks fall into two categories. Precocial, meaning they're born ready to run around and feed themselves almost immediately, and altricial, meaning they're born helpless and need extensive parental care. Terror bird chicks were technically precocial. They could walk and had feathers, but they had one massive problem: their beaks. While adult terror birds had these massive bone-crushing weapons, juvenile beaks were proportionally tiny, weak, and basically useless for hunting anything bigger than insects. It would take years, literal years, for that beak to develop its full size and strength. So picture this: you're a juvenile terror bird. You're already the size of a large dog, maybe 50 to 70 pounds, which means you need a lot of food, but your beak is still too small and weak to hunt effectively. You're too big to be fed by your parents anymore. They literally can't catch enough food to sustain themselves and feed multiple growing chicks that each weigh as much as a human child. So what do? Well, you don't do anything. You become food. This is sort of like if human teenagers needed 10,000 calories a day, but didn't develop teeth until they were 25. Except instead of figuring out smoothies, their parents would just eat them. And I know that sounds metal as hell, but here's the thing. It gets so much weirder. So you might be thinking, okay, that's horrible, but surely the parents at least tried to protect their chicks from other predators, right? Wrong. Evidence suggests that terror bird parents basically practiced a form of extreme tough love that can only be described as survival of the most paranoid. Fossil nesting sites show that terror bird chicks didn't stay in nests. They scattered immediately. Like within days of hatching, these chicks would just leave. And they had to, because staying near the parents was actually more dangerous than striking out alone. Here's why. Adult terror birds were hypercarnivores, meaning at least 70% of their diet was meat. But unlike mammalian predators that have complex social structures, think wolf packs or lion prides, terror birds were largely solitary. They didn't hunt in groups. They didn't share food. And most importantly, they didn't seem to recognize their own offspring after a certain point. Paleontologist Louis Chiappi's research on forest wrassid nesting behavior suggests that terror bird maternal care lasted maybe a few weeks at most, after which the chicks were on their own, just completely abandoned. Left to figure it out. Good luck out there, kiddo. And get this, the chicks knew it. Analysis of juvenile terror bird bone growth patterns shows something fascinating. They grew incredibly fast for the first year or two, way faster than modern birds of comparable adult size. A paper published in 2010 examining Andalgalornis fossils found that juveniles were putting on muscle mass at rates similar to modern chickens, which are basically biological growth hacks bred by humans for maximum speed. Except terror bird chicks weren't domesticated. They were just terrified. Their bodies were literally speed-running growth because staying small for too long meant staying vulnerable. Think of it like this. Imagine if human babies were born knowing that their parents might forget who they are and eat them after 6 months. So evolution just said, screw it, let's make puberty happen in a year. That's essentially what terror bird chicks were dealing with. Their bones show evidence of extreme stress during growth. Irregular bone density, signs of nutritional deficiency. Basically every indicator that these birds were growing as fast as biologically possible, consequences be damned. Oh, and here's the real kicker. This wasn't even the weirdest part of their reproduction. Terror birds laid relatively small eggs for their body size, about the size of an ostrich egg, despite some species being twice as tall as ostriches. Why? Because smaller eggs meant shorter incubation times, which meant less time being vulnerable while sitting on a nest. A 2019 study estimated that terror bird eggs probably hatched in about 40 to 50 days, which is fast for a bird that size. But it also meant the chicks were born even less developed than they might otherwise be, which made the whole vulnerable to your own parents thing even worse. Basically, terror birds evolved a reproductive strategy that makes Game of Thrones look like a heartwarming family sitcom. You know nothing, Jon Snow. Try you know nothing, juvenile forest wrasset, and also your mom might eat you. And the really messed up part? This strategy worked incredibly well for 50 million years. Because here's the thing about having parents that might eat you. It's actually a pretty effective population control mechanism. Terror birds never overpopulated their environment. They never ran out of prey. And the juveniles that survived to adulthood were, by definition, the smartest, fastest, and most paranoid members of their species. Evolution basically turned terror birds into a self-regulating ecosystem where the apex predators kept themselves in check by occasionally eating their own children. Nature is metal, and terror birds are the entire Iron Maiden discography. So what's the point of all this horror? Why would evolution create a system where apex predators occasionally snack on their own offspring? Well, it turns out this might have been one of the keys to terror bird success. See, most apex predators face a problem. They're so good at killing that they eventually run out of things to kill. Lions in Africa, for example, can decimate local prey populations if their numbers get too high. But terror birds had a built-in population control system. When food was scarce, juvenile survival rates plummeted, not because they starved, but because they became food themselves. This created a weird sort of balance. During times of plenty, more juveniles survived to adulthood, increasing the terror bird population. During times of scarcity, juveniles became an emergency food source, preventing adult starvation and maintaining the breeding population. It's dark, it's brutal, but it's also kind of genius from an evolutionary standpoint. The species basically made themselves extinction resistant by building in a buffer population that could be recycled. I hate that I just used that word, but honestly, what else do you call it? Now, before you judge terror birds too harshly, it's worth noting that filial cannibalism, parents eating offspring, isn't actually that rare in nature. Hamsters do it. Some fish do it. Even chickens will occasionally eat their own eggs if they're nutrient deficient. But terror birds took it to a unique extreme by having this weird window of vulnerability that lasted years. Most animals that practice filial cannibalism do it with very young offspring, eggs or helpless newborns. Terror birds were potentially hunting and eating juveniles that were already the size of adult humans. To put this in perspective, imagine if adult humans occasionally hunted and ate teenagers. Not babies, teenagers. Kids who could run, think, and fight back, but just weren't quite strong enough yet. That's essentially what we're talking about here, and the teenagers knew it. Which is why they evolved to grow up as fast as biologically possible while staying the hell away from adults. This actually helps explain something that puzzled paleontologists for years. Why are juvenile terror bird fossils so rare? For a group that dominated South America for 50 million years, we found surprisingly few young individuals. And the answer might be that most of them got eaten by their own species, leaving no fossils behind. The ones we do find are either the unlucky ones who died from other causes, or the rare juveniles who survived long enough to start developing those signature massive beaks. Every juvenile terror bird fossil we have is basically a survivor's tale, which makes them even more remarkable when you think about it. Recent research has also suggested that this extreme juvenile independence might explain why terror birds were so adaptable. A 2021 study examining forest wrasset remains from multiple sites found that different populations seem to have slightly different hunting strategies and prey preferences, not just between species, but within them. The theory is that because juveniles had to figure out survival on their own from such an early age, they became incredibly adaptable problem solvers. They couldn't rely on learning from parents, so they had to experiment, innovate, and adapt or die. This meant that terror bird populations could adjust to changing environments much faster than species that relied heavily on learned behaviors passed down through generations. So let's circle back to where we started. Why did terror birds, apex predators that dominated an entire continent for 50 million years, fear their own babies? Well, they didn't fear the babies. They feared what those babies would become if left unchecked. Or maybe more accurately, they didn't fear anything at all because they were birds with walnut-sized brains, operating on pure instinct. But the babies absolutely feared the adults, and that fear kept them alive. Think about that for a second. Terror birds accidentally created a system where their offspring evolved to be terrified of them, which made the offspring faster and smarter, which made the species as a whole more successful, which allowed them to dominate South America for longer than most mammal lineages have even existed. They literally weaponized child abandonment and occasional cannibalism into an evolutionary advantage. Nature is metal. And here's maybe the most sobering part. We almost never would have figured this out if not for those rare fossilized bite marks on juvenile bones. For decades, paleontologists just assumed terror birds were like modern retites, emos, ostriches, cassowaries, with normal parental care. It wasn't until we really looked at the growth rates, nesting behaviors, and those telltale bite marks that we realized, oh no. These birds were playing survival mode on nightmare difficulty. From birth. So the next time you see a cassowary at a zoo and think, wow, that's a scary bird, just remember, its prehistoric cousins were twice as tall, 3 times as heavy, took 10 years to grow up, and spent that entire decade running for their lives from their own parents. And they still managed to dominate an entire continent for 50 million years. Honestly, I think they earned that terror in their name, even if they mostly terrorized themselves. Thanks for watching, and until next time, maybe appreciate your parents a little more. At least they didn't try to eat you. Probably.